Hello, welcome back to Fuller Exegetical. I'm continuing the series on the early chapters of Genesis and comparing what those chapters actually say to certain young Earth creationist claims and seeing how those two things line up. Last week we talked about Genesis 5 and the very beginning of chapter 6, which is the genealogy of Seth through Noah, as well as this abbreviated, mysterious narrative of Nephilim and divine beings interbreathing with humans. This week, we're talking about the flood narrative, Noah and the ark, and everything going on there. Now, in past weeks, I've laid out a couple of young Earth creationist claims just to keep in mind throughout the rest of the episode. This week, I'm going to do that a little bit differently because some young Earth creationists, certainly not all, have certain claims about this text that really aren't that related to what the text actually says and are mostly fabricated, so we can kind of just throw them out. The first one is the idea that Noah lived in an advanced or industrialized society. There's nothing in the text to imply that. The logic goes that because people lived longer, they had more time to pass on knowledge, to gain knowledge, to invent and innovate, and therefore they might have been more advanced than we would expect. There's not much more to it than that, and there's nothing in the text about that. The next one is similar, and it's the idea that Noah may have had some engineering or shipbuilding training in his lifetime. Again, the text doesn't say anything about that or plan that. It's more of just an after the fact trying to explain why he may have been more skillful than we would expect. Another one is that the ark was not a simple box, which is what the most straightforward reading of Genesis would imply. It's more like a floating house than a boat. But the claim might be that it actually was more boat-like, and we just don't have the further instructions, that it may have had a keel and a rudder and sail-like structures and other structures to make it more seaworthy. That's fine, I guess, if you want to speculate, but there's nothing in the text to imply that. The text gives us its dimensions and just a couple of features, a door and a window and a roof, really. Another speculation is that Noah and his family may have done some kind of food production, whether that was insect farming or otherwise, on board the ark during the journey. The text simply says they brought the food that they would need for themselves and the animals. Doesn't say anything about food production. And the final claim is that there were dinosaurs on the ark. And quite simply, the text just doesn't reference dinosaurs or make any claims about creatures that we should interpret as dinosaurs. It's just not there, and so it's purely speculative. It's a fabrication at that point. Now, I do want to introduce a topic in regard to biblical exegesis, and that is the idea of source criticism. And with biblical interpretation, what source criticism is trying to do is trying to understand the source texts that the authors and redactors of the books we have now may have drawn on to compile these narratives. What texts were they looking at when they were writing this? And obviously we don't have those source materials, but by examining the text carefully and comparatively, we can gain a bit of understanding of what those texts might have been like. Now, with regard to Genesis and the Torah as a whole, there's the most common and, until very recently, the most well-accepted hypothesis is called the document hypothesis. And that states that Genesis is compiled from 4 source materials, and those being the Yahwist source, usually abbreviated J, the Elohist source, abbreviated E, the Deuteronomist source, abbreviated D, and the priestly source, abbreviated P. And that is to say that rather than the traditional view that Moses wrote the Torah, which, while yes traditional, is not explicitly in the text itself, and by reading the text we do seem to get a lot of linguistic and literary differences in perspective and the concerns, so it does seem like there's multiple authors here. And document hypothesis attempts to explain that by putting forward these 4 source documents and then assigning different sections of the Torah to those different sources based on what we can tell about them, usually the types of words used. Now, like I said, that was at one point the most widely accepted hypothesis. In recent years, it's become less so. with a couple other hypotheses put forward. There's the fragmentary hypothesis, which basically says that rather than 4 discrete sources, we have a number of many smaller sources and pieces and short narratives that over time were all compiled together and redacted and brought together into the text and the books that we have in our modern time now. Another one is the supplementary hypothesis. And the supplementary hypothesis really says that there was some original source material, and then it went through 2 phases of redaction where additional sources and additional material was used to enhance it and was added in. Those 2 sources being the priestly source and the Yahwist source. And those are kind of the more prevalent sources we see even in classic document hypothesis. But even with all these different hypotheses and looking at these through different lenses as far as documents and things, a lot of scholars now are kind of combining different theories and hypotheses, so it becomes difficult to classify. But for our purposes, for this video today, it's not important that we break down exactly each source and what source we're looking at and nail it down to a single hypothesis. It's more important that we understand that what we're probably looking at is a compilation from multiple sources, viewing things from multiple angles, and that in Noah we seem to have multiple versions of this story interwoven together now into a single account. And as we look at it in that light, I want to try and stop any reflex to try and smooth over the bumps or fix the differences, but to embrace the text in its current state with these different versions of account with repetitions and contradictions, to let it sit in that tension and let these different perspectives speak on their own terms. The redactors, the authors, knew about these differences. They weren't dumb. They knew they were including these different accounts, and they left them both there, or multiple versions there, for a reason. And I think it's good to allow ourselves to sit with that and contemplate those. I also want to draw attention to the fact that, as I alluded to last week, other ancient Near Eastern cultures had their own flood narratives and stories. The most common and well-known is probably the Atrahasis, but we also see it in the Epic of Gilgamesh. These different but very similar global flood narratives shared by all these cultures. And they are very similar, but the Bible is still unique among them. Genesis is unique among them, just as each of them is unique from the others. One of the main ways that Genesis account is different is the reason for the flood. So in the Atrahasis, the reason for the flood is that basically humanity's become too numerous and is being too loud and is annoying the gods, so the gods decide to wipe out all humanity. Whereas in Genesis, what we see is God is concerned and grieving the violence and wickedness of humanity, and honestly, it's almost like condemning a collapsing building at that point. But with all these differences and all these similarities, it's less likely that one of these stories is based on the others or that the others are based on it, but more likely that they all draw on a common tradition of a global flood narrative. And it's important to know that these cultures lived in an area of the world where flooding, severe and often unpredictable, is not unheard of and not uncommon. So it makes sense that they would have these narratives about floods and what that means for them and the gods and the working of the universe. Now, in the flood story in Genesis, we often call it Noah and the Ark, or the story of Noah and the Ark, or the story of Noah. But in reality, Noah is a rather minor character in the narrative. The story is about God. Everything is told from God's perspective, and while Noah barely even has any dialogue or action at all, God is constantly speaking and acting. We're given insight into God's inner working and thinking and God's emotional state even. Now, as Genesis 6 starts off, we have this interesting language about God seeing creation and seeing the wickedness of humanity and the effects of sin across creation. And this calls us back to Genesis 1, specifically Genesis 1:31, where God sees all that he created and calls it good. And now God sees all that he's created, all of creation, and all the growth that has happened, and it's filled with wickedness and brokenness. It's filled with violence, and it's gone awry from the plan. And as we saw last week, sin and the consequences of sin did not stay with humanity, but grew to even encompass these heavenly beings who then reproduced with humanity, and it became this cosmic impact. And now that cosmic impact, the entire universe and the effects of sin in it, have grown to such a degree that it touches the heart of the Creator, and we are given insight to see that God is grieved and sorrowful to see the state of creation. And that's the emotion that's carried out throughout this, is not so much wrath and anger as it is sadness and grief on the part of God, a pain at seeing the state of creation. God seeing creation in this state describes it as corrupt, and that there's corruption everywhere. And this corruption works as a translation, but the word could also be translated as ruin or ruinousness. And it's related to the word that God later uses to say that he will destroy everything. Destruction and corruption are related in that way. You could think of it as, like I said earlier, a house that is in such a state that it needs to be condemned and destroyed. The foundation's cracked, the frame is rotting, the roof is leaking, the mold is growing, and it just needs to be destroyed. That's the image of creation we're given here, in the language of destruction that's being used. But this language of destruction is quickly broken with the notion of mercy, of God seeing Noah and having favor on Noah and his family. Condemnation is quickly given way to mercy, which is ironically and paradoxically the overwhelming point of this narrative, is God's mercy in the midst of judgment. Much more time is spent talking about how Noah and his family and the animals are going to be saved and are saved than is spent on discussing the specifics of how the flood happened or the drowning and destruction and carnage that must have gone on. That's all glossed over in light of mercy. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the description of the ark, the dimensions that are given to Noah, are just that, dimensions. We're given description of a big box enclosed on all sides and covered in pitch, with two openings, one for sunlight and one which is a door for Noah, his family, and the animals to enter through. That's all we get. We don't get an elaborate description of a ship or further features or mechanisms on this vessel, just a sealed box. Actually, in the Atrahasis, it's not a rectangular box, it's a perfect cube, a bit of a different perspective, but still a box, interestingly enough. And the word ark is actually only used in one other place in the Bible, and that is in the story of Moses being put in a basket in the Nile. Again, his own little ark. And Moses really kind of becomes a second Noah, and the story of the Exodus is very much a flood story, from the prevalence of water imagery to the idea of God bearing his people out of danger, even drawing them through dangerous waters which drown out the wickedness they're running from in the migration across the Red Sea. Now, when this narrative starts to talk about the different animals that Noah is to put on the ark, we see one of the first duplications in this story. 2 different times and 2 different accounts of how many animals are to be brought on board are given. The first says that it's 2 of every kind of animal, a pair. It doesn't give any distinction between clean or unclean animals, just 2 of every kind of animal. The second account in chapter 7 does talk about a distinction between clean and unclean animals, where Noah is to bring on board 7 pairs of the clean animals. And again, this reflects different accounts, different sources with different perspectives. One clearly being more concerned with ritual purity, with the temple and the actions of the temple and sacrifice. That brings us into chapter 7. And in this chapter, we're going to see a few more of these odd duplication events. One of which is Noah and his family seem to get on the ark 2 times, one in 7 verse 7 and one in chapter 7:13, both of which Noah and his family get on board the ark in response to the flood beginning. So we're getting also 2 beginnings to the flood. Further, in chapter 7, we get two durations for the water's swelling. One being 40 days and 40 nights, the classic number that is often cited. So 40 days and 40 nights of rain. The other one being 150 days of the water's swelling and coming forth. So slightly different accounts for the beginnings of the flood. In either case, the imagery is really profound in that the fountains of the great deep burst forth and the windows of heaven are opened. If you remember back to chapter 1 in the creation account, that's imagery of the expanse of the firmament being opened up and the space in which all of creation exists being created. That space is now being collapsed with the waters pouring through. And as the waters rise over even the highest mountains, the dry land is taken in back under the chaotic waters, and all of creation is returned to its initial chaotic state. Creation is undone in the flood. But we come to chapter 8. And at the very beginning of chapter 8, God remembers Noah. Not a remembrance in the sense of he forgot and got back to him, a remembrance in the sense of faithfulness, that God was coming through in his promise to protect Noah and his family and the animals. And the inclusion of the animals is important because they keep being included as part of God's plan, as receiving of God's mercy, and even being included in God's covenant. God doesn't make a covenant only with humanity, but with all of creation. And in God's remembrance of Noah, he sends a wind over the waters. And again, we're called back to Genesis 1, where the Spirit or the wind from God hovered over the great deep. Now again, the wind from God hovers over the waters. It doesn't just hover there, but it sends the waters away, and the waters abate. God's Spirit closes the windows of heaven and the fountains of the great deep, and the expanse is created again. The waters recede and abate, and dry land emerges again. Creation starts over. Creation is recreated. And in the ark, the creatures who are to inhabit and fill these spaces are waiting to be released to be fruitful and multiply again, to continue the charge that God gave them in the beginning. In this imagery, Noah becomes like a second Adam, a new progenitor to all of humanity. Upon leaving the ark, Noah makes a sacrifice, and God makes 3 promises. The first is to never again curse the ground. This draws us back to Genesis 3 and the curse of Adam. Now, God is saying he will never make that same curse of the ground again on humanity's behalf, almost drawing back from that curse and that making of the work so much more difficult. God seems to be easing up in that. The second is to never again destroy all life by use of a flood or otherwise, simply never again to destroy all life. The third promise is that seasons and weather and the natural order of things will go on into perpetuity, that there will be an order to the world, that agriculture and human society will be able to go forward because the natural order will be maintained. Interestingly, God's reason for these promises and this mercy is the same one given for sending the flood in the first place, the evil or the sinfulness of the human heart. Humanity hasn't changed through this whole narrative, as we'll see in coming verses. This didn't fix sin or wickedness. It's God who seems to have changed, at least in his relation to humanity throughout this story. It's God who has the ark in this narrative. Again, God's the main character. And we see here God putting limits on himself and how he'll deal with humanity and approaching sin and wickedness in a different way. God chooses faithfulness and mercy even in the face of human faithlessness and sin. And when we look at this in light of God's grief and sorrow at the beginning of this narrative that's seeing human sin, if human sin and the human heart hasn't changed, then that grief and sorrow really hasn't changed. So we see God choosing to endure and suffer through that sorrow in spite of human continuing to be sinful. God choosing to be merciful and move forward towards salvation and working in humanity even in imperfection. The flood narrative sets up the character of God and sets up the character of God as one of mercy and as steadfast love and of faithfulness. That brings us to Genesis 9. Genesis 9 starts off with blessing of God repeating the blessing of Genesis 1 of creatures, including humanity, to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth, to continue in that original function. But for humanity, things get complicated. Because of human violence and sin and wickedness, the relationship between humanity and animals and creation in general has become complicated by fear and violence, bloodshed, by eating meat. God makes a concession to human violence by allowing humanity to eat meat, but still puts boundaries on it. That the life, the blood, still belongs to God and isn't to be taken by humans. And further limitations on the killing of humans, a prohibition against it, and stating that God will be the final judge of anyone, human or animal, who kills a human. And it has this phrase here which seems to maybe have been sort of a colloquial idiom of the time, that anyone who sheds human blood will be killed by humans, which could be seen as an affirmation of capital punishment, or it could merely be a recognition that humanity will deal with each other in this way, but still recognizing that God is the ultimate judge in these cases. God is the final judge for violence. God again repeats the promise to never destroy the world with a flood. Self-imposes this limitation on how God is to deal with humanity and human sin and creation. Again, sticking with it in this steadfast love and faithfulness to see things through and not destroy the world. As a sign of this covenant, God sets his weapon in the sky, his bow being the rainbow, not as a sign to humanity, but as a sign to God's self, as a sign of peace that acts as a comfort to humanity, yes, but also a sign to God, a reminder, not that God forgets, but a symbol of the peace that he has set up in that covenant. So in conclusion, the flood narrative paradoxically focuses on mercy in the midst of judgment and destruction, yes, but focuses on mercy and speaks to God's faithfulness in the midst of human faithlessness and sin. Also, we can see that this story has so much to speak to us on the character of God, on understanding of humanity and humanity's relationship to creation. And it speaks so deeply, and there's no need to write fan fiction and add all these details to try and fill in perceived gaps of some scientific history. The story stands well on its own. So that's all I have this week. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you learned something. If you think I missed something, let me know. Next week, we're going to continue on with the last bit of chapter 9 on through Genesis 11, covering the variety of things that fall in that section of Scripture. So I hope you'll come back for that, but thanks for watching.